Hello friends, welcome to my YouTube channel, The Current Affairs Audiobooks. This channel has been created to provide updated info about various current affairs issues.
Hello friends, recently the 48th G7 summit was conducted in Germany, which was attended by Indian Prime Minister Modi on invitation. Today we will have a look at the salient aspects covered in the 48th G7 summit. Let us have a look at the background of the G7. The Group of Seven is an intergovernmental political grouping consisting of countries like US, UK, Japan, Italy, Germany, France and Canada. It is a gathering of some of the most economically and politically powerful democracies in the world. The representatives of the European Union have always been present at the annual meeting of the heads of state. The G7 consists of 7 of the world's richest countries which meet annually to typically discuss global security, economic and climate concerns. The first World Economic Summit, which later became the G7, was launched in 1975. Initially, it was a group of 6, that is Germany, France, Great Britain, Italy, Japan and the US. The participants exchanged ideas on the economic problems of the 1970s, that is the first oil crisis and the collapse of the system of fixed exchange rates. In 1976, Canada was added to the group and the first G7 met in Puerto Rico. Since the Ottawa Summit of 1981, the European Community, which is now known as the European Union, has been part of all the working sessions. In the 1980s, the interest of the G7 expanded to include foreign and security policy issues. In 1998, the group of 8 was constituted as Russia became a member, but it was thrown out of the group after its violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in 2014. Germany has the G7 presidency for the 7th time this year. Japan will be the president in 2023. Let us have a look at the significance of the G7. As of 2022, the G7 countries make up 10% of the world's population. However, they have 31% of the global GDP and 21% of the global carbon dioxide emissions. In all G7 countries, the annual public sector expenditure exceeded revenue in 2021. Most G7 countries also have had a high level of gross debt, especially Japan, which is rated at 263% of GDP, Italy at 151% of GDP and the US at 133% of their GDP. The G7 countries are important players in global trade. The US and Germany in particular are major export nations. Both these countries sold goods worth well over $1 trillion in 2021. China and India, the two most populous countries with amongst the largest GDP figures, are not part of the grouping. Let us have a look at the 48th G7 summit proper, which was held from 26th till 28th of June 2022. The theme of the G7 summit was progress towards an equitable world. The goal of the G7 countries is to guide the work of the G7 based on 5 areas of action: sustainable planet, economic stability and transformation, healthy lives, investment in a better future, and stronger together. The German Chancellor has invited India, Argentina, Indonesia, Senegal, and South Africa to the 2022 summit as partner countries. A number of international organizations, including the UN, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, also participated in the summit. The focus areas of the G7 included topics such as partnerships for developing countries, global economy, sustainability, multilateralism, food security, and digital transformation. What is the significance of the G7 for India? Since 2017, it is the 4th consecutive time that India has been considered to attend the G7 summit. The country has been invited to G7 in a nod to its growing geopolitical influence, which offers it a seat at the table where the world leaders decide important outcomes. The United States has justified India's invitation to the G7 summit amidst the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine. The US said that India is invited since the agenda is diverse. The US clarified that they are not trying to splinter India of Russia. Prime Minister Modi was welcomed by a Bavarian band. Such a grand gesture has only been received by the former US President Barack Obama when he visited Germany in 2015. The Indian Prime Minister was also treated as a guest of honor at a dinner party hosted by Bavaria for all the G7 leaders. This is the first meeting between Modi and Biden after they met in Japan for the Quad Summit in May. During the 3-day meeting, the G7 leaders discussed a wide range of topics, including Ukraine and cooperating on foreign policy, addressing energy and food security, investing in climate and health, promoting partnerships for infrastructure and investment, shaping the global economy, advancing gender equality, and shaping international cooperation. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the global economic fallout, such as soaring energy and food prices, has dominated this year's summit. The G7 summit was dominated by the Ukraine crisis, but Mr. Modi referred to the ongoing war in Europe indirectly. The key takeaways from the G7 summit are as follows. Mr. Modi clarified India's position on the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Amidst the pressure from the Western countries at the G7 summit, India reiterated that there must be an immediate ceasing of all hostilities and to take the route of dialogue and diplomacy. The Prime Minister also put forward the knockdown effect of the conflict on food security crisis, especially on vulnerable countries. Mr. Modi also pitched a lucrative offer for the G7 countries to invest in India's emerging green and clean energy market. Mr. Modi also said that the scale that India can provide for every new technology can make that technology affordable for the whole world. He reiterated that a huge market for clean energy technologies is emerging in India and G7 countries can invest in research, innovation and manufacturing in this field. India accounts for 17% of the global population but is responsible for 5% of global carbon emissions. The Prime Minister highlighted India's efforts towards clean energy, saying that India had the world's first fully solar-powered operated airport. India's huge railway system will also become net zero by the end of this decade. Mr. Modi also said that India had achieved the target of 40% energy capacity from non-fossil sources 9 years before time. The statement issued by Mr. Modi was largely hinted as India's response to align with the G7 agenda of cutting off India's link to the Russian energy sector. They also intended to pressurize other countries like China, which is a major buyer, into severing energy ties with Russia. Mr. Modi also referred to India's projected post-pandemic growth rate that is expected to be 7.5%. Mr. Modi further reiterated the clean energy sector, which has emerged as a major domain in India. He summed up saying that India's dedication to climate commitments were evident from its performance and exhorted developed economies to invest in this arena. What are the major outcomes of the summit? The G7 leaders adopted a communique to jointly defend universal human rights and democratic values, the rules-based multilateral order, and the resilience of democratic societies. On Ukraine, the G7 leaders re-emphasized their condemnation of Russia's illegal and unjustifiable war of aggression against Ukraine. The G7 countries have pledged and provided 28 billion euros in budget aid and are strongly committed to support Ukrainian reconstruction through an internal reconstruction plan. On energy and food security, the G7 leaders committed to phase out the dependence on Russian energy sources. They ensured to secure the energy supply and reduce price surges by exploring additional measures such as price caps. The G7 countries will also increase global food and nutrition security through the Global Alliance on Food Security. On economic issues, the G7 leaders remained committed to coordinate on economic security, strengthen the resilience of supply chains while tackling rising costs of living for citizens. Towards health, the G7 leaders reaffirmed their commitment to equitable global access to safe, effective, and affordable vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, and other essential medical goods. On climate and environment, the G7 leaders endorsed the goals of an international climate club to accelerate the implementation of the Paris Agreement. The G7 leaders committed to a highly decarbonized road sector by 2030, a fully and predominantly decarbonized power sector by 2035, and also committed to prioritizing the acceleration of the phase out of domestic unabated coal power. The G7 countries have launched the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, which is known as PGII, which is a joint initiative to fund infrastructure projects in developing countries. Through the partnership, they aim to mobilize $600 billion over the next 5 years to narrow the global investment gap. The US President made a formal announcement to mobilize $200 million for global infrastructure projects over the next 5 years. It is largely seen as a counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative. China's Belt and Road Initiative has left many poor or low-income countries across the world in a debt trap and resulted in China's dominance over those countries, including in policies and even land. The latest example of this exploitation is Sri Lanka. This has made many countries around the world nervous and hence the initiative. India has been one of the worst affected by China's debt trap diplomacy, and this global infrastructure and investment partnership could in turn ease India's neighborhood tensions. Building on their existing partnerships with South Africa, the G7 also committed to work towards new just energy transition partnerships with Indonesia, India, Senegal, and Vietnam. Reiterating democratic values, the G7 leaders committed to cooperate with civil society and partners to strengthen the resilience of societies, promote human rights online and offline, address disinformation, and achieve gender equality. The G7 also reiterated ahead of the summit the need to work towards achieving the World Health Organization's goal of vaccinating 70% of the world's population against coronavirus by mid-2022. Prior to the summit, the G7 nations had agreed to provide an additional $19.8 billion in economic aid to Ukraine. They have imposed sanctions on Russia, targeting some of the country's biggest banks, major state-owned enterprises, and elites and their family members. They have committed to working towards phasing out or banning Russian oil. More recently, the US announced that it would send an additional $1 billion in military aid. It has already committed $4.6 billion in security assistance since Russia's invasion. France promised that it would send Ukraine 6 more truck-mounted artillery guns. Germany's defense minister agreed to send 3 multiple rocket launchers, which would be available for Ukraine's use in July or August. Canada announced that it would be providing at least $9 million worth of military aid. Since the war broke out, Canada has promised $274 million in military assistance to Ukraine. Let us now analyze what the G7 has achieved. The G7 nations are keen to enlist greater support from New Delhi, particularly in ensuring that it doesn't help Moscow circumvent their sanctions. There have already been calls for India to curtail its purchases of Russian military equipment. The proposal for setting price caps on Russian fuel has been mooted. However, details of modalities and how the G7 nations intend to achieve this has not been provided. Talks have also been on to reduce the dependence on China. However, the G7 nations are split on closing business with China. All G7 nations have tried with China, and the UK Prime Minister emphasized that business with China could not be avoided. A new climate club has been proposed, but details of timelines, members, and charter of the new climate club have not been specified. With respect to composition of member nations, Canada has a much lesser GDP than Australia, and Italy has a lesser GDP than India. However, these nations still form part of G7. It is time to review the same. The leaders of the G7 countries pledged to stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes by cranking up sanctions on Russia and backing security commitments for Kyiv in a post-war settlement. To meet the WHO goal would require substantial acceleration of the global vaccination campaign. To sum it up, in the G7 there has been plenty of talk but little to offer. With this, we come to the end of our discussion on the 48th G7 summit.
Please do let me know if you would like to know more about current affairs topics in the comment section. If you like the content, please do like, share and subscribe to my channel. All the best. Jai Hind.